College football is officially back in session. Week 0 is complete. Week 1 is among us. And capitalizing off of week 1 to conclude the end of what should be a very intriguing week 1, USC and LSU. Now, we've already previewed the Tigers and the Trojans, but there's so many more storylines to get to. You're talking about two head coaches that are primed for needing a big week 1 win to secure their place as some of the top coaches in college football. More than just preseason hype, more than they're just overrated. Hello, everyone. I'm Lucas Hill here of SECU Unfiltered. Make sure you check us out on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe. Hit the bell notifications for every time we post a new video. Also, check us out on every social media, Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok at SEC Unfiltered. And joining me now to talk about this big matchup and much more from the Trojans and the Tigers is the host of Locked On USC. It's Marc Kulkin. Mark, glad to hear the flight to Vegas was a good one, man. How are you feeling?
Feeling great. Haven't lost any money yet, so it's always good. Can't wait. Cannot wait for this game. As far as I'm concerned, I've been around. This game's been in the making for 20 years. When USC and LSU split that national championship back in 2003, 2004. So while this doesn't settle everything, it sure does. Sure is a nice way to open the season. How's that?
Right. And I heard earlier, whenever you were on with Matt Moscona earlier, I think on Monday, and you guys mentioned about the level and significance of that game specifically. Are there still hard feelings when it comes to that? Knowing that who really deserved the national title back in 2003?
I don't think there's any hard feelings. It was just, the system kind of cheated both programs. I guess that's the best way to do it. You look back at that season and USC lost one game in triple overtime on the road. And when they finished off Michigan in the Rose Bowl, it's hard to say, that's not one of the best teams in the country, if not the best team. And it's just a shame that USC and LSU didn't get to play that game. They played 2 times in their past. USC came into Baton Rouge back in 1979, left with a victory. They went on to the national championship that year. 5 years later, 1984, LSU returned out to LA. They kicked USC's butt, 24-3. So, I guess we can call this the grudge match, the best of 3.
40 years in the making.
Right.
But like you mentioned, Mark, this is a matchup it's basically 20 years in the making. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't think there's any hard feelings. I think just you have 2 rabid fan bases that have really probably been looking forward to this game ever since they saw it on the schedule, ever since it appeared.
Yeah, and so let's just go ahead and just dive into them. When the first thing you look at when you look at both of these teams, you're talking about first-year defensive coordinators. You guys, obviously, with D'Anton Lynn and Eric Henderson. Henderson's coming from the Rams, who was the former defensive line coach, and D'Anton Lynn's coming in from UCLA. LSU, on the other hand, with Blake Baker coming in from Missouri, who's kind of already made a name for himself in the improvements that they had at Missouri. So I know I'm a Southern guy, and this might be just my bias, but talk to me about these 2 defensive coordinators that are coming in from USC and Lynn and Henderson and what they bring to the table and what you've seen so far from the fall and from spring, seeing how the defense has been ever since the disaster that Alex Grinch brought last year.
Yeah, as far as I can comment with Baker, is he's bringing over the system that he had at Missouri, and it was working really well. Now, the difference between D'Anton Lynn is not only is he bringing his system to USC, but he's also bringing in some more talent that USC lost into the draft. LSU lost some talent to the draft as well. USC hit the portal hard to try and supplement what they needed, specifically more size and more help on the defensive line and at the linebacker positions. It was just fortunate that he also was able to bring in some some secondary help as well. 2 safeties, one from UCLA, Kamari Ramsey, another all-conference player, Achille Arnold from Oregon State. And then you have a couple of cornerbacks he brought along as well, one from UCLA, John Humphrey, Another one from Mississippi State you might be familiar with, DeCarlos Nicholson. So I think the biggest difference is both programs are putting in new systems. However, one program is using the parts that were still behind for the most part, LSU, and D'Anton Lynn is saying, all right, I'm going to take all my new pieces and I'm going to make my system work this way. So it's going to be a nice chess match to see which program has made the biggest jump as far as improvement goes. And coming out,
I think it's going to take a while too, just for both defenses to get settled. And I think it will take up until maybe close to the end of the second, going into the second half as well, to get both defenses adjusted to their respective new alignments from what previous years have shown as well. So.
Absolutely. For USC fans, they just want to see a defense on the field that looks like they know what they're doing. It got to the point last year where you literally the opposition knew that at a certain point in the snap count, Alex Grinch is going to have his defensive front shift. And once that shift happened, you knew the play was going the opposite direction every single time. USC fans just want to see a competent defense on the field, that they know what they're doing. They know how to tackle because they have the talent. That's never been the issue at USC. These last couple of years, it's been more about scheme and the culture. Hopefully, Lincoln Riley is ready to say, you know what? I am not just going to be an offensive-minded coach. I'm going to back up my words that I said at the end of the season. Everything going forward is going to be with the defense in mind first, making sure this team is a championship caliber program. So we're going to find out.
So Will Campbell was quoted earlier in the week saying that this is going to be a fist fight. And that gets a lot of people juiced up. They're going to, USC is going to use that for pregame hype videos. You know that LSU is going to use that and try to use that as words. I don't see it really as fighting words to me, to be honest with you. I just see it as the truth. It's going to be a fist fight. And you look at the matchup that you're expecting. You got 2 first-round offensive tackles in Emory Jones and Will Campbell on the outside, going up against what should be an improving USC front four led by Bear Alexander. So talk to me about that chess match up front.
Yeah, I love the way Will Campbell talked. He's an upperclassman. He's been through the wars before. This isn't his first rodeo. And he said it plainly. We're going there for business. We're going there to get in a fight. And that's the ultimate sign of respect for your opponent. Yeah, I mean, it comes off as, hey, we're going for a fist fight. We're going to kick some butt. I like that kind of talk. You need that type of juice behind you. And if it helps motivate the opposition, great. You can only, run on emotion for so long. Eventually, you got to play the game, right? So, yeah, LSU has a huge, in my opinion, they have the advantage on the offensive line. You talked about your 2 bookends. You're big across the board. USC, their goal, if they can get pressure on Garrett Nussmeier, I think that can help, stem the tide a little bit. Number one, USC has to stop the run. And that's going to be the first thing that I think LSU is going to do. Will Campbell even talked about that. We're going to run the ball. If USC can't stop the run, it doesn't matter. They're not going to be able to get pressure on Garrett because they're not going to throw the ball unless it's absolutely necessary. So that's the chess match. Can D'Anton Lynn, can Eric Henderson and Sean Nua get that front four? Can Coach Matt Enns, who's taken over at the linebackers, can those guys make enough of an impact? Can the scheme out-scheme what LSU plans to do with Brian Kelly's offense? And your new offensive coordinator, Joe Sloan.
Right. And that's one's going to be some pretty big shoes to fill as well. When you're talking about a guy that has to replace a guy like Mike Denbrock, who was a Broyles Award finalist last year, and now you're bringing in a guy who, I mean, I think this is only his officially 4th year as an offensive coordinator, because he spent 3 years at Louisiana Tech as an OC, then comes to LSU as a quarterbacks coach. But I think he's ready. He's been in this position before. He's had to replace top-tier talent. He's had to step into roles that he really was comfortable with. The guy's 37 years old. I mean, he's been around the game since he was at East Carolina in 2005. And taking over from a quarterback's coach to an OC brings new responsibilities. But at the same time, you're basically just becoming a play. It's just being calling the play.
No, look,
he's
taking on some more
how to read a defense. You know how to adjust at the line. Responsibility, but honestly, this is nothing new for him. You know, this is going to be fun. This should be a fun game for Joe Sloan to call.
What I'm looking forward to is how Joe calls a game without your leading rusher back there also being your leading passer. And I think that actually benefits USC. Not a lot, but a little bit, where they don't have to focus on a quarterback that, you know, what the play does break down, or to design play for the quarterback to run. I don't think that's Garrett Nussmeier's game. He's more of stay in the pocket. He's going to use his arm. He's going to find his receivers. That might help USC. So again, I'm interested to see how they come out on offense without Jaden Daniels, because that was I think we're being honest, that was a major chunk, a big production part of LSU's offense last year. Not only are you losing those guys on the outside in Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, which was a chunk of production, but now you're also removing your leading rusher. So can USC stop the run between the tackles? I know you got a big bruising running back there you're going to try and go with. And can USC play with the tight ends? The game's going to be won in the trenches. I have no doubt about that. I think it's going to be a red zone game. Whichever defense can force the other team into field goals as opposed to allowing touchdowns, that's going to be the difference in this game.
And you talked about that young running back. And overall, on both sides, it's so crazy how both of these teams are so similar in style, too. Okay. You got brand new coordinators. You got brand new quarterbacks. You got a brand new offensive system. You got two young defensive coordinators that are coming in, unproven yet. A lot of questions are on the defensive side of the ball. And it's primed to be basically a showcase of who's improved since last year and who's taken a step back. Which brings me to my next question for you, Mark. We've known about Lincoln Riley and the talent that he's had ever since he started his head coaching reign at Oklahoma in 2017. And he's had a lot of talent with him. He's had Heisman winners like Baker Mayfield, like Kyler Murray, like Spencer Rattler, like Caleb Williams. I mean, you're talking about some of the best quarterbacks that are on their way to the NFL right now. And now you have a young, unproven quarterback in Miller Moss that looked really good in the Holiday Bowl against Louisville. But, of course, Louisville's defense was mixed. Same goes for Garrett Nussmeier. He did well against Wisconsin, but how does he fare in a real competition against an improving defense as well? So, and then when you look at Brian Kelly, you see the expectations that have been for LSU since basically the 2010s. You're expected to compete for a national title year in and year out. And I've continually expressed this in my other videos. In year 3 or 4 is usually the big year for most of LSU's coaches since Nick Saban was here. Won a national title by year 3 of Nick Saban. Les Miles won a national title by year 3. Then Ed Orgeron comes in, wins the national title by year 3. Brian Kelly said, judge me by year 3. So let me ask you a question. Now that I've given you the rundown, who should be under more pressure? Should it be Brian Kelly or should it be Lincoln Riley?
I think they're both under pressure, but for different reasons. For the reasons you laid out with Brian Kelly, if you're going to take on the job, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it, of coaching in the SEC, especially at a premier program like LSU, you have to produce. You don't get that. There is no more 5-year window. I mean, that's been gone for a long time. In year 3 at LSU, you have to be at a championship level. Same thing at USC. The difference between Brian Kelly right now and Lincoln Riley is Brian Kelly said, look, year 3, we're going to be competing for a national championship. Lincoln Riley kind of set the bar that we're always striving to play for a championship, but we've got a bigger hill to climb. He took over a roster that was not your typical USC roster. And all of a sudden, year one, here comes USC out of the box, 11-3, Heisman Trophy. They are literally a pulled hamstring away from going to their first playoff appearance. And then they follow that up year two with Lincoln Riley going 8-5 because he kept the same porous defense with the same defensive coordinator. And everyone had told him, you got to make this change if you want to get over the hump. You cannot be known as a guy, hey, I don't care who my quarterback is, we're going to score points. Doesn't matter if you can't stop anybody. USC lost at home, scoring 40-plus points, giving up 52 to Washington. USC barely won on the road at Cal, 50-49. I mean, you can't win those games. Eventually, they catch up to you. They kick in the butt, and that's what happened to USC last year. So Lincoln Riley has to prove that he's put on his big boy pants. He's ready to become a complete coach and allow the defense to be a big part of how the program moves forward. So as long as he, watches the offense and he lets Danton Lynn take care of the defense, there's hope. USC fans are saying, all right, we see there's a good formula out there right now. He's backing up his words. He went out and got one of the best defensive coordinators out there. Danton Lynn comes from the Baltimore Ravens tree. His father, head coach, Anthony Lynn. He went and he convinced a national championship coach at North Dakota State, Matt Entz. He said, Coach, do me a favor. I want you to take your 2 national championships, bring them to LA with me, and come with me. And I want you to be my assistant defensive coordinator in charge of the linebackers. And then he said, we're going to do one more thing. We're going to go get Eric Henderson from the LA Rams, who, has been developing guys like Aaron Donald, Kobe Turner, the guy from Wake Forest, who I believe was the rookie of the year, rookie defensive player of the year, I believe. He outbid Georgia for Doug Belk as their new secondary coach. So there's a commitment. There's been a commitment to defense, and that's the first step for Lincoln Riley. He admitted he had the problem. He ditched the problem. He's a good friend of his, and I understand why he held on to him. But now it's the next chapter in Lincoln Riley's life. And as long as USC looks like they're improving on defense, as long as Lincoln Riley has a quarterback he trusts, everything's going to be fine on the offensive side of the ball.
Marc Kulkin of Locked On USC joining us here on SEC Unfiltered. Want to give a shout out to our good friends, one of our newest sponsors of SEC Unfiltered. It's the GameTime app. Download the GameTime app for your Android or Apple device and use code SECU to get $20 off of your first purchase. I'm looking at some of the tickets right now on the GameTime app. Guess what? GameTime is your #1 source for last-minute tickets for the cheapest price. Looking at some of the cheapest ones so far, get yourself $100 to get a ticket out to Vegas. So, honestly, in total, including the flight, depending on when you go, or if you decide to drive, could be about $200 or $300. But why not take some of that off? Get yourself $20 off your first purchase. Shout out to GameTime for sponsoring us here at SEC Unfiltered. Let me ask you, Mark, and this might be a pretty interesting question. Does Lincoln Riley's seat get hot if you have another season like you had last year?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. And as I just mentioned, he has to show that he's willing to subjugate the offense sometimes. In other words, he has to put that ego aside and say, I know I can score points, but what's in my team's best interest? Let's use the pieces I have with me instead of trying to make the pieces work for me. And that I think that's a really good sign of a good head coach.
I do think Brian Kelly, I don't think his seat burns, but very well, expectations are going to be extremely, extremely high. I say high, they will be very low, especially going into next year when you lose a lot more talent. When you lose Will Campbell and Emory Jones and Kyron Lacy and Garrett Nussmeier for next year. So now you're going to have to build on for 25. Now you got all those recruits that's coming in, and you look at that recruiting class, it's really deep. Now you're going to have to lean on those young guys, but all likelihood, I do think Brian Kelly could eventually get on the hot seat if not this year, but next year also leads to missed expectations as well. Want to get your thoughts on that as well.
Well, the thing that really jumps out to me is LSU has always been known for their defensive backs, always pumping them out, putting them into the NFL. And same thing at the wide receiver position. What strikes me as interesting is last year, LSU's secondary wasn't very good. Neither was USC's. But LSU's is actually worse. And that's hard to do because USC was really bad on defense. But I didn't see, maybe you can, educate me here. Has there been an infusion of talent in the secondary since last year? Because I think that if that's LSU's weakness and USC's strength on offense are their young, big, talented wide receivers, and that doesn't even include the Zachariah Branch. How does this chess match play out? Again, you brought in the new defensive coordinator, but does he have the pieces necessary to go against USC's strength, which might be LSU's weakness?
Yeah, and I'm all behind you. There's talent, no question about it. But talent five stars will eventually get you beat. You know this, and we both know this, You can have probably the most talented guys in the world. We've had guys that come through. We had Jair Brown, who came in from Ohio State. He did fairly well during spring. He's still got a lot to learn. Zy Alexander, who was an All-American at my school, Southeastern, comes in LSU, does okay near the end of the year, gets hurt. He's still rehabbing from his injury. So I think the biggest thing is that LSU has to stay healthy too in the secondary because there's a lot of talent in that secondary. And some of them could be even better than what we saw during the first part of Brian Kelly's tenure. But it's all about how they really just improve from last year to this year, because the biggest mantra that I've heard, they can't be worse than what we saw last year. Secondary wise, there's a lot of questions, but you bring in another DB's coach that was there for a while. He was there during the DBU era, Corey Raymond, who's a legendary recruiter, knows the state of Louisiana. He's brought in guys. He's bought in to the DBU mantra. That's a guy that you want as your secondaries coach, and a guy that you love to bring back to Baton Rouge, who knows how to bring back that swagger that LSU lost since the end of, maybe even since after the 2019 season. You saw a decline in really talent that has come through, other than Derek Stingley, who, if you think about it, really played one good season and then kind of disappeared afterwards. And now he's tearing it up in the NFL.
Right. Look, I'm eating from the same bowl of mantra that you've been eating from. Again, for me, it's going to be an interesting chess match to see which team can say, all right, you know what, we're better than we were last year. That's what it's going to come down to. New scheme, new players, both sides of the ball for both teams. Who's going to be able to impose their will? That's what it's going to come down to.
Couple more questions before we let you go, Mark. I know you got a busy day ahead of you, especially for this weekend coming up. First of all, other than this chess match that's going to be up front, what is one thing that you're really looking forward to see from Miller Moss and how he has progressed throughout the offseason since you've gotten a chance to look at him?
Yeah, I just want to see how much more into, I guess, being on his own. I know that he's going to run the play that Coach Riley calls. But when things break down, how has Miller taken that game to that next level? In his first start last year against Louisville in the bowl game, he had some guys, breathing right down his throat before he was getting rid of the ball, but he was throwing lasers, throwing dimes. Was that a one-game thing, or is he going to be able to take that next step and do it against a team like LSU, who has, as we've been talking about, they recruit very well. So they're going to have probably bigger, stronger, faster players. Not that much better than Louisville, who last year was considered a top 30 defense. Can LSU get into Miller Moss's face? Can they put pressure on him? Can they disrupt his timing with his wide receivers? If they do that, LSU's going to have a really good day. If they can't, Miller Moss is going to, he's going to eat. I'm not trying to disparage LSU. That's not my intent. But I know the receiving core that he has to work with. He's been practicing with those guys all last year during practice when they were freshmen, and he was the backup. So they already had that chemistry. They already had that familiarity, and it showed up in the bowl game. Now they've had all of the off season, another spring camp, and now all of fall camp. This is a very talented wide receiver group. You have 6'6" Deuce Robinson, and it's not just big. He runs like a deer. You have 6'4" Jacoby Lane, who has bounce. I mean, basketball bounce. He's got a 48-inch vertical. He's got a 7-inch wingspan. He's an athletic freak. You probably know about Zachariah Branch. He's a human joystick. I know Brian Kelly is concerned about him specifically on special teams because he's a threat to return it on kickoff or punt return. And then you have a fourth wide receiver in those four sophomores. His name's Mekhi Lemon. And if you know who Amon-Ra St. Brown is, plays for the Detroit Lions, one of the top wide receivers in the league. Mekhi Lemon is Amon-Ra 2.0, and he's actually bigger than Amon-Ra. Wow. Okay, and USC has more depth behind that. So those are their four sophomores. That's their core. Again, if LSU gets pressure on Miller Moss, you negate all that. USC has to stop LSU's run game, and USC has to be able to establish the run as well to keep LSU's defense honest. Harold Perkins, that's the guy that concerns me the most. Keep an eye on him.
The thing about Harold Perkins is that, I mean, you put him anywhere on the field, and he can be lightning in a bottle, and you saw it. He has game-breaking ability. He has the opportunity to do so much. And when you put him at will linebacker, aside from Greg Penn, that's probably one of your deepest position groups that you have on the defensive side of the ball. Because secondary-wise, you have talent, but you're not deep. You don't have that experience factor. Defensive line-wise, you have talent. Again, don't have the experience. Secondary linebacker-wise, I'm more confident in them than I do almost anywhere else on the defensive side of the football. So when you can plug in Harold on third down blitzes, you see him creeping up, I can guarantee you at the snap of the football, he's shooting A-gap quick. I don't think that center is going to be able to get back into his stance enough, and I don't think that running back is going to be able to block a guy like Harold Perkins. So with that brings me to my last question. I have LSU on upset alert this one. I do think that it's going to be a big offensive game. The over-under is about 62 or 63.5. Yep. I do think it may go under, but at the same time, we don't know what the defenses are going to show. We don't know how they're going to perform until we get into the second half of the ball game. So I do think that it could be an under game. I don't think it's going to be 52-49, but I do think it's going to be more or less in around the 30 range. So I do think LSU should be on upset alert for this weekend. And I do think that USC could potentially pull off the upset. LSU hasn't won an opening day game since 2019. That's when they last won the national title. So I wanted to get your pick, Mark, for this game and see what the defining factor will be in this game as well.
Yeah, look, we've been talking about it. Two new defenses. There's going to be mistakes in the game. There's always mistakes in game one of the season. So, hopefully there's not a lot of bad beats where guys are, where the teams are giving up big plays. I mentioned earlier in the show, I think this is going to be a red zone game. The defense that can kind of bow up, so to speak, in that red zone and force field goals instead of allowing touchdowns is going to have the advantage. This is the type of line that I don't like to bet. It went from LSU -6.5. It's now down to what? -4.5. We'll see where it is at kickoff. That's a line that says, get away, do not bet me. So yeah, I would be with you. I'd be looking at the over under based on, you have two offenses that have the ability to be explosive. I can see this going over, but at the same time, everybody's dealing with that new helmet communication device. Is that going to slow the process down a little bit? Or will there be fewer offensive series in this game? You kind of saw that a little bit last week with Florida State, Georgia Tech. I'm interested to see how that works with USC this year. Lincoln Riley with Miller Moss. I would think it would be advantageous because they speak the same language. Lincoln Riley being a quarterback guru, Miller Moss being an assistant for 4 years now. But again, I don't know. I have to see how that plays out. Yeah, I think both teams are. You're saying upset alert. USC isn't the favorite, so I can't say they're on upset alert. This can go one of two ways. USC can either get steamrolled. LSU just owns the offensive line, does what they want, or USC can do enough on defense, and their offense does enough, and they come out on top. I'll say 37-33. How's that?
I like it. I could see that, honestly. Just
it could go either way.
It's going to be close going into the fourth quarter. Like you mentioned already, we don't know what the defense is going to do. It's game one. We're going to struggle. So, either or, it could go either way. 37-33 for either or. And let me ask you this as well. Could this potentially be a game for both teams? If they win, could they potentially clinch themselves for a potential CFP berth as well?
It's a hell of a start. I know when USC leaves Las Vegas, they're going to go home and play Utah State. So they get a bit of a break. Then they're going to have a bye week. And then they travel to Ann Arbor, Michigan to take on the reigning national champions. We're going to know who USC is by the end of week 3. If they can come out of these first 3 games 1-1, or excuse me, 2-1, 3-0, absolutely. USC is going to be riding a wave of confidence like no one's seen probably since the Pete Carroll era. I know they got a little bit of a taste in 2022 when Lincoln Riley took over, but you can always feel like, when's the dam going to break? It's going to burst because this defense is just, they're creating turnovers. But if they're not creating turnovers, they're not stopping anybody. And that all came crashing down last year. So, yeah, obviously, you talk about LSU having winning an opening game for forever. USC, this is a meaningful game. If they can come out of the gate, beat LSU, they can say, you know what? We did what we needed to do in the offseason. We made those changes. And it's going to open eyes. So, yeah, it's huge. But you got the 12-team playoff system now. I don't think you're out of it in week 1. I know Florida State fans are pretty depressed right now for good reason. Still, I don't think when you play in the big conference or in the SEC, one loss out of conference to a team that have the initials USC or LSU kicks you out, so to speak. You've got plenty of games left on your schedule to get back to where you need to be. I'm of the opinion, if you have a 10-2 record coming out of those 2 conferences, you're going to be in the 12-team playoff field.
And that's the strength of college football in the Power 5 system is the SEC and the Big Ten. It's been discussed during the offseason. Everybody's complaining about Florida State and Clemson, how they should move from the ACC to either one of those conferences. But with your Florida State, if you can't even win a conference game, and if you can't even prove to yourself that you belong to move outside the conference, shut your lips, play ball. That's all I got to say for them. Marc Kulkin joining us of Locked On USC, talking LSU and USC as we get set for kickoff this upcoming Sunday on ABC. Marc, it's been a pleasure talking to you, man. Where can we find you on all social medias?
Absolutely. So on X, Marc Kulkin, at Marc Kulkin. When I'm not doing the Locked On USC podcast 5 times a week, I am also doing some writing at wersc.com. And we also do a weekly podcast over there called Inside the Trojan Huddle. I'm everywhere.
And you guys are an affiliate of On 3 as well. Is that correct?
Correct.
We love working with our guys. Yes. We love working with our guys at On 3 and with the Locked On community. A great group of guys, great group of media personalities. Very one of the most up and rising media personalities in all of college football in the Locked On and the On 3 group. Mark, it's been a pleasure having you on, man. Let's have a great game day and a great start to week one. Have a good one.
You too, man. Thanks again.